Hi, I'm a Forester here with one of my pool table knife reviews. I don't know if you knew that I do these on a pool table, because normally this is all that you see. But today we're going to be reviewing the beautiful Spyderco Sage 4. This is the latest of the Sage series, honoring different knife designers and locking mechanisms. The Sage 4 is built to honor the Almar mid-back locking knife design. In all of the Sage knives, Spyderco incorporates other design features besides the locking mechanism though. So you'll see a lot of similarities between these two knives here. This is the only Almar knife that I have. It's the Eagle Classic. And although these two knives are definitely different in shape and size, you can see several similarities between them that I'll point out also. The blade and handle shape of this Sage 4 are consistent with the Sage series, but the mid-back locking mechanism, the metal bolsters, the natural handle materials, and just the general construction of these two knives are similar. Here's an audible similarity that I can see between these two knives. Listen to the Almar as it opens. Now listen to the Sage as it opens. That's a sound that inspires confidence. Let's clear the deck and look in detail at the material and the construction of the Sage 4. To me, the most attractive feature of this knife is the wood handle scales. They're made of desert ironwood, and that's a tree that only grows in the washes in the Sonoran Desert in the southwestern U.S. I'll insert a picture of a desert ironwood tree. But because the scales are made of a natural material, each knife is going to be unique. Now I do want to point out that I think that Spyderco is doing a little bit of bait and switch between the picture that they show in their 2012 catalog and the knife that you'll probably receive. This is the knife that they show, and it shows a burl wood. Burl wood is the wood that comes out of a knot in a tree, and it usually has a lot more intricate detail to it, and it's in more demand. Because it's in more demand, probably there's less of it, and that's why the wood that you're probably going to get in your Sage 4 if you order one is going to be more straight grained. I've seen 2 or 3 of these knives and they all had this type of wood. That's not a big deal to me though, because this is attractive also, but I did want to point that out. I've been tempted to baby this knife because I didn't want to mark up the wood scales, but then in preparing for this video I came across this sharp folder because it's also a lockback design, and it has wooden scales. Let me give you a close-up of it. But the wooden scales on this knife actually have held up very well, and I've used this knife probably 12 to 15 years. This used to be my basic work knife. The wooden scales have probably held up the best of any part on this knife, definitely better than the blade. You can see some very ugly nicks in the end of that blade. That was my fault, not the knife's fault, but I was testing a wire that I thought was dead, and there was a strand that I just flicked with the tip of this knife, and it actually melded 2 places in the blade. That's something I want to repair one day and get back to using this knife. But getting back to the Sage 4, it has some other features that are very much like the Almar Eagle. One are the titanium bolsters. The bolsters and the ironwood are both mounted onto a steel frame. And I'm going to show some close-ups of this knife rather than try to get this camera to focus in on it. So I'll just describe it, and then at the end of this video there'll be some close-up shots. But the way that the titanium and the wood marry to that steel frame is just excellent. It shows the excellent construction that went into this knife. The liner is drilled out to reduce weight just a little bit. And on the back I'll show a close-up of how the titanium and the steel marry together. Again, just excellent construction. Another construction detail that I want to point out is how the edges of the titanium are chamfered, and I'll show a close-up of that. But the edges of the ironwood are also chamfered just like the titanium, and they marry together beautifully. Ironwood's a very dense wood. It's so dense that it doesn't even float, and it's excellent for woodworking. And so I'll show a close-up of that and show you how the detail behind it. Before I leave the handle though, let's look at the clip. This is the very first wire clip that I've ever had, and I have mixed feelings about it. Placement on it is fine. It's either going to be right or left-handed carry, but it's always going to be tip up. The tension is just about right. My only issue with it is that it has some side-to-side play, and I think that'll eventually show wear on the wood finish. Also, because of that play, it doesn't feel quite as solid in my pocket as other clip designs. The blade is a typical Sage shape. It's made from CPM S30V. I'll give you a close-up of it. It's made in Taiwan. It came out of the box razor sharp. Now, I've been using this knife for a couple of weeks, but let's just do a cutting test and see how sharp it is. I really don't think I've ever had a knife come out of box this sharp. The blade is squared off at the top. That's something that could be in deference to either the Sage or the Almar design. Jimping is on the top here and also on the bottom in that finger choil. And I'll show some close-ups of this knife so you can get a better view of it. I think the jimping is just right. It's not too aggressive, but it's more than just cosmetic. The ergonomics of the knife are excellent. I tend to always hold it using this forward finger choil, and it gives me a solid grip on the knife. The forward part of this finger choil sticks out far enough to where it protects my pointer finger during use, and especially when closing the knife. Well, I saved the locking mechanism to last because I wanted to compare this knife to several other lockback designs. There's an excellent write-up of how the mid-back lock design came about in some literature that came with the Sage knife, and I'm going to take the time to actually read a portion of it. It's right here under Design Inspiration. In the late 1960s, Harvey McBurnett, Dick Dora, and W.T. Fuller worked together at a tire factory in Alabama. After Fuller tragically lost one of his hands in an industrial accident, the three men, all machinists and aspiring knife makers, collaborated to design a folding knife for Fuller that could be easily opened and closed with one hand. The result was the front lock folder, an evolution of the classic full-length back lock that dominated the folder knife market at the time. By shortening the lock bar and adjusting its spring tension, the three men created a folding knife pattern that allowed the lock to be easily released using only one hand. Interestingly, they also created a theme for their own respective careers as custom knife makers, as all three ultimately specialized in making fine, handmade front-locked folders that are now highly prized collector's items. And it goes on to say that in 1977, Almar bought the rights to this knife and started Almar Knives. Let's bring out the Almar Eagle again, since it's the knife that's being copied. And notice where the locking mechanism is. It's forward of the midpoint of the handle. And this is the most forward position of any lockback design that I have. In comparison to it, the Sage has it just forward of the midpoint position, but not as far forward as the Almar. The sharp knife that I showed you before has the lock in the most rearward position back here, and it makes it very hard to close. In fact, the only way that I can close it is to press that lock and then shake the knife and shake the blade down. But you run the risk when you do that of having that blade fall on your finger and possibly cutting you. That's in the most rearward position of any knife that I have. I have two other knives with the lockback design. One is this Delica, and it has that lockback mechanism in right at the middle point of the handle. And then the other knife that I have is a Cutco Sportsman's knife. I've done a review of this knife. It was one of the first knife reviews that I did, and it's in about the midpoint position also. So that locking mechanism can be in any number of places, anywhere from in the most rearward position all the way to a forward position about 1/3 from the front of the knife. I will say that the closer to the front of the knife that lock mechanism is, the easier it is to close with one hand, all other things being equal. The tension on the lock has a lot to do with it also. This Delica is a good example. Even though that locking mechanism is at the midpoint, the tension on the blade is so light that it's very easy to close and operate one-handed. Probably that's the easiest knife to operate. The Sage is easy to operate. The locking mechanism is in a more forward position, but the action is just stiffer and the tension on that lock bar is tighter. But it's easy to operate one-handed. Okay, let's clear the deck and get back to the Sage. Put these other knives up. Well, how would this knife be used? I would never carry the Sage 4 for a tactical knife, mainly because it's got slower deployment, a stiffer action, and a shorter blade. The blade's around 2 3/4 inches long. However, any knife would be a tactical knife if it's all you had at the time. How about an EDC knife? You know, something to throw in my pocket every day. Some would say it's just too heavy for an EDC knife, and it is the heaviest of the Sage series. Some days I use a knife a good bit. On one of those days I can't see me taking this Sage 4 to the woods when I could throw a beater knife in my pocket, like this Tenacious, which I use a lot, or the Kershaw Skyline. In fact, this week I worked outside in the woods several days, and I carried this Skyline. I ended up dulling it and having to resharpen it after several days. In my case, the Sage 4 is destined to be a light, occasional EDC knife. I don't see it being as popular as the other Sage lineup, mainly because of its weight and beefiness. It's a pretty thick knife. There will always be knife enthusiasts like me, though, that are attracted to it, so it should hold its value. Meanwhile, I'm enjoying carrying it. It's a looker, and it does a mean job of opening an envelope. Y'all take care.